Sigoli Nerioliwas, Skanagoga, Skanago. I just said in Oneida, greetings, what is the news? Are you with peace? I am with peace. It is me, Dr. Reed, giving you what you need. Welcome, week 7, Vermont Law and Graduate School. You all are phenomenal human beings who are worthy of love. It has been truly an honor. I'm emotional now, grateful for each and every one of you of the learning that we've got to do side by side over the last 7 weeks. And looking forward to our final push here, our final swan song. Let's have some fun together here for our week 7. Just want to say Yawonko, thank you in Oneida. It has been truly a pleasure. In the words of the Mohican practitioner, Don Coyhis, that longest journey the human being makes between the head and the heart, that 18-inch journey. It's just been a pleasure to be going on that journey with each and every one of you this semester, engaging our head space and our heart space, exploring restorative practices all over Mother Earth, all over our globe, from different tribes, different nations, and seeing how we as people come together and put our minds together as we seek to create healing, as we seek to create community, as we seek to create justice, as we know that justice is in the eye of the beholder. And it's been a pleasure hearing all of your perspectives and all your takes throughout the group meetings, throughout the conversations of what your take is on justice, restorative justice. And it has just been truly a pleasure to learn from each and every one of you. So let us continue here. I look forward to your final projects to learn from each and every one of you due before this Sunday at 11:59 p.m. So for our final week together, just want to say, Yawonko again, thank you for our time together. I want to talk about some influential court cases and statutes, just talk about the conversation, how we can continue this learning as well, how you can help either be an Indigenous person reclaiming this space, re-indigenizing our world, and also as an ally of how you can help create a community and help you can create a better world for generations to come in this new frontier of leaders. And what is the ocean if not a multitude of droplets of water all working together? And lastly, I love to finish off classes by sharing from this graphic novel, Echo, a beautiful one that pulls my heartstrings, and hopefully it leaves an impact on yourself as well. As you can see here, we are in our circle process. As my grandmother taught me, whoever is holding the eagle feather cannot tell a lie, that everyone else is listening as intently as you are when you're speaking. So thank you very much for sending me good thoughts and well wishes, and for listening to me now. I send you all well wishes and good thoughts and positivity and love. So here's some impactful policy towards Indigenous peoples. Let's start off here. Doctrine of Discovery, 1493. This palpable bull, any lands not inhabited by Christian peoples would be considered terra nullius, or empty earth, which would be used as precedent later in the Johnson trilogy. And again, in a court case in the 2000s against the Oneida peoples of New York. Indian Commerce Clause in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, that treaties that the United States is to interact with tribal nations the same way as it does with different states, with different foreign entities, and that same way with tribal nations as sovereigns. Indian Removal Act of 1830 was the legalized extermination and removal of Native peoples. Put forth one of the famous people, Andrew Jackson, would be one of the people proponents of this as well. But extermination and pushing out of Native peoples being removed from their lands. Morris Land Grant College Act was another land that a piece of legislation that a lot of land that was taken from Native peoples would then be given to different educational institutions. So an interesting one that Vermont Law and Graduate School had a symposium about in 2022. Very eye-opening and interesting information there. Major Crimes Act of 1885 lets it be known by if it's murder or a number of other severe cases that the federal government says, okay, if it happens on a tribal nation, if it happens on Indian country, if it happens on a reservation, if it's a major crime that we deem in this 1885 act, then we have sovereignty as the federal government to come in and to act. So it supersedes the tribal sovereignty there. Definitely not really equals in terms of sovereignty there. Still federal government coming in. And I would say a condescending way of saying, well, if you can't handle these crimes, that we can here. Dawes Act, also known as the Indian Allotment Act of 1887, which was another area where all of Oklahoma at one point was supposed to be Indian country, and then at different points, the federal government had parceled off and sold off different regions and different parcels of land, some of the highest bidders. Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, from before this time that Native American people were not deemed as United States citizens. So anything talking about in the Constitution or everything before that, Native people were not a part of this. Even my great-grandfather, Anderson William Cornelius, who fought in World War I, served the United States Army, him and roughly 12,000 other Native veterans who served in World War I were doing this before they were United States citizens. Not that all Native people are monoliths, so I cannot speak for all Native peoples, but when asked my family, who continued on this legacy of service, Out of my 12 great aunts and uncles, 8 of them served in different branches of the military. And I've been told by my great aunts and uncles that when you're a warrior, you're tied to the land, you're tied to protect the people, no matter what, no matter who's in charge. It is your responsibility to take care of the land, to take care of the people. And my great grandfather would talk about in an interview, and what is this book called The Lost Voices of the Oneida, that he would talk about that maybe someday that his descendants would be able to have the benefits that he fought for, that he was a Purple Heart recipient, received posthumously from my other relatives who fought to make sure that my great grandfather was given the recognition that he deserved even after he passed away. So it is an Indian Citizenship Act, 1924. Public Law 280, 1953. Many Native legal scholars would talk about this being a harmful undermining of tribal sovereignty in what is supposed to be, as noted in the Indian Commerce Clause, a relationship between the federal government and tribal nations has now been shifted in Public Law 280 to a relationship between the states and tribal governments. So really moving it more from a sovereign as an international to really more of a municipal, like a local government. This is in 8 states, including California, Wisconsin, a number of other states as well too. Indian Relocation Act in 1956. There was this idea, this promise from the Bureau of Indian Affairs in different brochures and postcards that really romanticized this idea of let's go to major cities, come to Los Angeles, come to Oakland, come to San Francisco, come to Seattle, come to Chicago, come to New York. And they promised jobs in education and housing. And there are different video interviews you can see of people who had lived through this and people who are, this is not forever ago in terms of 1953, people who are still alive to this day who would experience that. But in different interviews, I've heard people talk about how oftentimes they were bused from different communities, different tribal nations, and put into other communities that were often desolate, destitute, low socioeconomic areas, oftentimes with high crime. And people would be coming off of these areas and saying, well, whoa, this is literally what we just came from. What are we doing here? So this promise, what was put forth in the postcards was certainly not fully realized, to say the least, in terms of Native peoples being on their own once they had that first paycheck, or in certain circumstances, once they got dropped off at the bus, they're just in the city and now they're on their own again. And this idea of this mindset was in this termination era of the federal government. The idea, if we can no longer have Native peoples as Native peoples, then we no longer have a responsibility towards these peoples who are the original inhabitants of this land, the original tribal nations, the original sovereigns of this continent, what we know today. If we can assimilate, if we can terminate, get rid of Native peoples from their traditional relationships to the land, if we can assimilate the blood quantum out of people, then we no longer have a responsibility towards Native peoples. This would backfire in certain ways for from the federal government from Native peoples, and that Native peoples would bring forth some consciousness and their collective rights, which would be seen through the human rights movement, oftentimes for the Red Power movement is sometimes referred to, and people standing up for their rights, coming together, recognizing, saying that we do have rights, we do have responsibilities, and maybe we are from different tribes, but we have similarities in that we are fighting for our sovereignty to be recognized as human beings. Voting Rights Act of 1965, up until this point, many Native people were not given the right to vote. So you can see this play out, how different cities are set up and resources. This is why in the Dene Nation, also known as the Navajo, it's been estimated that approximately 1/3 to 1/4 of the residents in the Dene Nation do not have access to running water, do not have access to electricity. And this is largely, as up until 1965, many Native peoples or Dene peoples, for instance, were not given the chance to be voting or have a political say in where resources are being allocated. Having a master in public administration myself, I can tell you that is very important. Who are the stakeholders at the table? Who are the people able to make decisions? Who are being represented? Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975. This idea, it follows the trail of broken treaties, where a number of tribal people of the American Indian movement in cars would go across tribal nations, talking about all the different broken treaties and gathering this caravan of cars, following behind them until this whole snowball effect of people and leaders take over the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. for approximately 8 days, fighting for their rights. This is also around the same time, 1969 to 1971, is the occupation of Alcatraz, where Native peoples called the Indians of all tribes, they come together, occupying this once federal penitentiary, as there was a Fort Laramie, this treaty in the 1800s that recognized if a federal institution was no longer being used by the federal government, then tribal people would have the right to use of that. So this was a 2-year occupation that really spurred the collective consciousness of Native peoples in a global consciousness, so that Native peoples are still very much here, still very much with a culture, still very much being looked for fighting for their rights as human beings, as equals, as people with great value to share. American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978. Up until that time, it was illegal for Native American peoples to have their own religions, even though we are in the land of the free, home of the brave, where freedom of religion, one of our first and key amendments that we have. Yet it wouldn't be until 1978 that Native peoples were able to practice their traditional uses with plants and medicines, and having their own beliefs as well too. We see the Indian boarding schools. This was heavily beaten out of and sometimes killed children for these particular spiritual beliefs and language. Indian Gaming Regulatory Act in 1988. This is outlining some of the abilities for tribal nations to have gaming, to be able to support themselves as sovereigns, as I've heard it said before. And for instance, the state of Vermont, that if the state of Vermont didn't have a tax base, then it might look like a destitute reservation in some ways if you don't have some kind of revenue. So while casinos are not the end all be all, I know in my tribe, we were able to allocate these resources for education, elderly, healthcare, community development, for our police, different things that we have within our own community, our own police force, and our own health center, own elderly care service. Even then, I've seen it within my own eyes of negatively impacting people within our own community who have lost funds to gaming. Or for instance, when the COVID-19 pandemic occurred and quarantine and places were shut down, the casino shut down, and overnight, I believe it was around 1,500 people's jobs were impacted negatively, were lost jobs or that had to work towards getting employment again. Indian Arts and Crafts Act in 1989, it says that anything that has a native pattern, anything that has a native name, this is supposed to either be made by native peoples or it's supposed to have the funds directly benefit native peoples. One that I oftentimes will see still broken today, I think of the Jeep Grand Cherokee. I think of Oneida silverware, which everyone's always like, oh, Oneida, TJ, I know your tribe. I've seen that at Target before. To which I say, that is blatant appropriation, as it has no ties to the Oneida Nation, other than the fact that the Oneida peoples are known for being good with silver working. So using something that Native peoples are known by, taking a silverware company, calling it Oneida without actually benefiting Oneida people themselves. This can be seen as well too, sometimes Free People, other clothing stores, sometimes I've seen Anthropology, Ralph Lauren, different company in some ways appreciating Native culture, but in doing so, taking oftentimes what are sacred images for different peoples and putting them forth for proprietary, for financial benefit, oftentimes without benefiting the Native peoples themselves, where these images and ideas are created and come from. So the idea is if it looks like it's designed by Native peoples, it's supposed to be designed by Native peoples or benefit Native peoples. So when you can hold other people accountable towards all your law and graduate students. Grateful for you. Thanks for using your minds. Native American Languages Act. So I mean, even just greeting y'all in Oneida, saying Sagoli, saying greetings. That would have been illegal up until 1990. And even though maybe you've heard of the code talkers, Navajo code talkers. These are one of 33 different tribal nations who are used their tribal languages during different wars, different conflicts that the United States has gone through to help win wars, and was classified up until the 1970s. So many people passed away before they were even able to tell them about their experiences. We have some of this documented, but yes, the Dene or the Navajo is one, but there was actually up to 33 tribal nations, including my peoples of the Oneida, who were also code talkers to help us win wars as well too for the United States. And we would definitely not be what it is today had it not been for all the code talkers throughout the years. But yes, until 1990, it was illegal for Native peoples to speak their language. As you would see in the Indian boarding schools of kill the Indian to save the man, which was a motto of the schools. People like my great-grandfather who ran away twice. People like my great-great-uncle Joshua who was killed at Indian boarding school at Carlisle. Heavy things. People spoke the same language, oftentimes be separated. Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA, recognizing that Native peoples who are in the grounds, that there is a responsibility if found to be returned to the original Native peoples. They can be laid to rest in their proper ways, communities, and ceremonies. This also says that any cultural artifacts and remains, that these cultural artifacts are also put back towards these original peoples, the original owners of these cultural artifacts from the peoples and historically. Still occurs today. For instance, I'm on the NAGPRA committee at Cal State Long Beach, also otherwise known as Cal State Pavunga, which is the Gabriela Tongva word for the great gathering place here in Southern California, as we work to repatriate, return ancestors back to their original dwelling, their original relationship to the land. In Oneida as well too, for instance, when there have been children have been found at some of the Indian boarding schools and Indian residential schools in Canada, the idea that they'd be returned back in proper ceremony towards the Oneida people because of NAGPRA, and that we were able to put them to rest. Some of the saddest things, seeing some children's coffins, but having this cathartic release and healing that people never got to do for almost over a century, right? That we're able to do this now, that when we help heal ourselves, we help heal our ancestors. So, Yawonko, thank you for taking the time to listen now. I appreciate you. Violence Against Women Act, first put forth in 1994, then again, it was re-upped in 2013 and recently passed again in 2022. And it was just trying to put a little bit more teeth in some more legislative action to try to have more penalties for people that do violence against women, as we do. In case you don't know, that missing and murdered Indigenous women's, missing and murdered Indigenous peoples is a serious issue that happens across what we call Indian country, what we call Turtle Island, sometimes referred to as North and South America. So this is a step of action of trying to add more penalties where it's more jail time, more fines. Just everything is just bumped up significantly from where it was before in terms of legislation and trying to protect women. The United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP, put forth in 2007, recognizes a number of things. And amidst these is the idea that Native peoples have rights, and they have rights to their treaties, they have rights to these agreements. And out of the United Nations, to my understanding, there was a large collective action agreement saying, yes, in 2007, we agree, we accept this, except for 4 countries who said, you know what, we actually are not going to sign with that. And those countries were Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States, saying, you know what, actually, we don't want to recognize that, because if we do, then all these treaties would really be, majority of this land we'd have to either give back, or this has some serious legal implications if we were to acknowledge this. Now, there's an American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2016, significantly less teeth, but still an acknowledgement of the Indigenous peoples who are here. The Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010, again, trying to put legislation to support Native peoples and crimes that are occurring against our peoples. Savannah's Act and Not Invisible Act of 2020. This has to do with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and peoples. This idea that before this, that many of the databases that had information about these missing and murdered Indigenous women, Indigenous peoples, sometimes we hear the phrase two-spirit, this phrase that came in the 1990s from a doctoral thinker and activist, a Native activist, talking about this idea that for many different tribes, that the idea that to be able to hold 2 spirits, 2 genders simultaneously was seen as a gift. And for many different tribal nations, the idea that this binary of gender came with colonization, and that for many different tribes, to my understanding, at least over 200, at least, had more than 2 words for the idea of gender. So that being said, for Savannah's Act, Not Invisible Act, for this missing and murdered Indigenous women and peoples and 2 spirits, the idea that all these databases at the time, you'd have like a tribal database, you'd have a city database, you'd have a state database, you'd have a federal database, you'd have independent agencies working, and they were all working in isolation and silo without pooling these resources to actually have an idea of how serious this situation is, and where the numbers actually are and where the information is, that instead of just doing our efforts and doing them in isolation, we're putting forth our efforts in compounding ways to be able to share those resources to better help missing and murdered Indigenous women and peoples. That was in 2020. And this Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies and Act, as of September 2021, it is still going through Congress and Senate. And this idea that in Canada, there's a Truth and Healing Commission that occurred in the decades past. And now the United States is trying to have a similar one, where we are looking at the Indian boarding schools in particular, as there have been to my understanding, over 450 Indian boarding schools in the United States. I believe we have searched roughly 1 in the United States so far, which is Carlisle. And there were over 180 children's bodies found in the cemetery that were marked graves, another 13 graves that were marked for children who were not able to be identified when they were killed. This is just one school. In Canada, they've searched a number of schools. I believe the number is close to 10 or 15 as I'm talking to you now in 2023 of February. However, even with that amount, I've seen the number is somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 children's bodies who have been found so far, who finally get a return home. But families who never had answers, families like myself with my great uncle Joshua, who was killed at Indian boarding school. So that being said, if you are watching this and it has not passed yet, you have the power, yes, you, to call your senator, your congressperson. I've heard it said before, if we want it to become an issue, it can become an issue. We just have to make it an issue by caring about it, by talking about it, by bringing awareness to it. You all are thinkers and activists. One of my mentors, Dr. Malana Karenga, who created Kwanzaa, has reminded me of what we have this responsibility with learning not only for the sake of learning, but learning for the sake of action, learning for the sake of change, learning for the sake of a better development of a more just and equitable society. Some influential court cases include Johnson v. McIntosh, and we'll talk through all these here in a minute. So you can see these here. You can pause and take a screenshot, but we're about to talk about these more in depth in a moment here. So Johnson v. McIntosh, this is the first of what's called the Johnson Trilogy. Indians have only a, quote, right of occupancy and hold no title to the land. So a very harmful narrative that's really woven out of thin air and then is used as precedent for further federal Indian law cases. Also based the decision on that doctrine of discovery. Remember that idea, that 1493 Papal Bull? Remember that idea of separation of church and state? Well, in this case, not so separated. Well, it's you literally using this Papal Bull as legal doctrine, legal precedent, which would then be used for further precedent, and as this is now in the Supreme Court. Cherokee Nation versus Virginia, 1831. Again, it ruled that Cherokees were a dependent nation with a relationship to the United States. Look at this harmful phrase here, similar to a, quote, ward to its guardian. Again, this is the Supreme Court being woven out of thin air, being made up as they go, and then being put it and used now can be able to be used as precedent in the Supreme Court, 1831. And the last of the Marshall Trilogy here is Worcester. I've heard it pronounced versus Georgia. Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, and recognizing that the whole intercourse between the United States and Cherokee Nation is vested in the government of the United States. So it's saying, hey, only this is our relationship to work with this tribe, with different tribes in general. That is the power of the United States government. So 1832 ruling. Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, fairly harmful to say the least. It's recognized in the Supreme Court case that Congress has the power to modify or terminate Native American treaties without Native Americans' consent. So I'm not sure how you feel about this, if this is a true treaty, a true agreement, if someone's like, oh, by the way, I can break it off whenever it feels convenient to me. That's 1903, Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock Supreme Court case. Winters v. United States, 1908, recognizing that the United States itself could abrogate rights granted to the Indians under a treaty with them, but it alone had this power. So if other companies or other people want to do this, say, hey, you don't have that power, only we can abrogate, only we can stop or terminate treaties when we want to without Native American people's consent. Morton versus Mancari, 1974. This was saying that they are allowed to, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to give preference to Native peoples themselves, to other Indians within this process, and saying this does not violate the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment, as it's important to have that cultural understanding, this lived experience, as was argued in the case. Oliphant versus Suquamish Indian Tribe, 1978, United States Supreme Court case deciding that Indian tribal courts have no criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. I was recently at Harvard and I heard Chief Justice Angela Riley talking about how in some cases so egregious it would be happening where non-Native peoples calling up like Native agencies while they're on tribal land, saying like, I'm about to carry out domestic violence and there's nothing you can do about it. They're saying that that's like the most egregious side of the spectrum. They're saying that on the other side of the spectrum that maybe not so egregious, but yes, it still happens where the large majority of offenses that happen where there's missing and murdered Indigenous women, this violence, domestic violence, more often than not, majority of the time, very high percentage number that it's non-Native people committing these crimes against Native peoples. When it's happening on Native territory, it's saying here that tribal courts have no jurisdiction over these non-Indian peoples. United States versus the Sioux Nation of Indians, comprised of the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and the different tribes the offshoot from those tribal nations. This is saying here that the 1980 award of these 9 tribes, which comprise the Oglala Sioux, $105 million for the illegal seizing of the sacred Black Hills, which broke the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. In 2011, this trust value had increased to $1.3 billion. Now here, the tribe still refused the money as they believe accepting the funds would constitute a transaction of sale of land, and the tribal nation leaders emphasize how the land was never for sale. Lyng versus Northwest Cemeteries, recognizing that the free exercise clause of the First Amendment does not prohibit the government from harvesting timber or constructing a road through a portion of the national forest that is considered a sacred religious site by 3 Native American tribes. So it's saying, you know what, actually, even though it's supposed to be your arguments for your religious, your spiritual rights, saying that's not a severe enough burden for us to consider that. Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians versus Holyfield. This is Supreme Court, United States, held that Indian Child Welfare Act governed adoptions of Indian children. So this is here, this one's supporting the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, which we'll talk about, and we've talked about in weeks past here. United States versus Laura, United States Supreme Court landmark case that tribes could prosecute an Indian for the same acts that constituted tribes in both jurisdictions, that same the United States and a Native American tribe. So it doesn't, they're saying this does not constitute double jeopardy. And these are separate courts that you can be tried for the same crime, the same acts. Brackeen versus Zink, this US District Court, Northern District of Texas in 2018. This is declared ICWA was implementing federal regulations that are unconstitutional. So this and other state court cases are the ones that brought it now to Brackeen versus Holland, which is before the Supreme Court right now, was argued on November of 2022 and is still being decided. Navajo Nation versus US Forest Service. Navajo people and 12 other nations made an appeal under the Religious Freedom Act to stop the artificial snow containing sewage water, which was used in the sacred San Francisco peaks. And again, the Ninth Circuit ruled this was, quote, not a substantial burden on the religious freedom of American Indians. They were saying, please, if you put this sewage water on this, that you're desecrating this sacred site, please do not do this. They're saying, you know what, it makes good artificial snow, not a good enough substantial burden. 2008. McGirt versus Oklahoma ruled that much of the eastern portion of the state of Oklahoma remains as Native American lands of the prior Indian reservations, what are known as the 5 civilized tribes, never disestablished by Congress as part of the Oklahoma Enabling Act in 1906. So as we talked about how most of Oklahoma, pretty much all of it, was supposed to be Indian country. This Supreme Court case, and sometimes the pendulum will swing either way. Sometimes saying things like wards of the state, and then sometimes exercising Native peoples as sovereigns. This would be a movement towards the sovereigns, saying, well, actually, this is all because of this different act. It's supposed to be tribal territories. United States versus Cooley, 2021. Tribal authorities can at least detain and investigate non-tribal members who are suspected of committing a crime. So before that, we talked about Oliphant versus Suquamish, so they didn't have any power. Well, now United States versus Cooley says, okay, well, now you can at least detain and at least investigate these non-tribal members who are suspected of committing a crime. Dinesp versus US, again, the double jeopardy clause does not bar successive prosecutions of distinct offenses arising from a single act, even if a single sovereign prosecutes them. So again, this is a person can be tried in the tribal courts and the state courts and the federal courts. Oklahoma versus Castro-Huerta, that the federal government and the state have concurrent jurisdiction to prosecute crimes committed by non-Indians against Indians in Indian country. So stepping onto, again, this bounds of what I believe is overstepping federal tribal sovereignty and stepping into that with federal sovereignty and state sovereignty and saying, well, you know what, we can also prosecute these peoples as well too, even though it happens against Indians in Indian country. And again, Brackeen versus Holland, argued November 9th, 2022, and it is arguing whether ICWA was allowed to put Indian children with Indian families, or is this discriminating on the basis of race in violation of the Constitution, and whether its ICWA placement preferences exceed Congress's Article 1 authority by invading the area of child placement, the quote, virtually exclusive province of the states. So this is what's being decided right now. There's been many amicus briefs, meaning friends of the court that have put in statements put forth. I know I've reached out to my elected officials to let them know, and they let me know they were in support of supporting ICWA as well too here in this case. So I would encourage you all, if this is still being decided when you're watching this, definitely make your voice heard. And it's a story we talked about before, but I'm going to remind you again that when all of creation was together, a bear rips out a tree, says, look what I can do, puts it down. The deer says, look what I can do. It runs over that tree in one move. Then the human being says, well, look what I can do. If I close my eyes, I can imagine a world like this one, only better. And that is our responsibility as human beings. And that was taught to me by Arlie, a Dene leader, and a phenomenal leader he is, and an elder. So some resources, you continue the conversation learning on GroupMe. Feel free to reach out to there with check-ins. We have each other's contact. Let's stay in touch. We have our YouTube playlist, which you've seen RJ and Indigenous communities. You can search it on YouTube, and there's hundreds of videos on there. We only just saw a tip of the iceberg, so please check out more videos. You can scroll down, press Control F to type in a certain topic or word if you're looking for a certain idea. And definitely reach out to one another for support. Now that you've heard each other's stories, you learn from one another, not only myself, but as each other as lifelong learners, whatever discipline, whatever field of study, whatever your sector is, that we can work together, that these great minds thinking alike, and that maybe we don't always agree on the same exact thing, but we can work together and put our hearts and our minds together. And there's so much more we can accomplish together than we can when we're apart. So together we are united, together we are strong. I love this one. Shout out to Dr. Pamela Taylor, elder in Kenya, who taught me this one as well too, in ancestral mathematics. You can see the source it's taken from here. And it said, for every one of us, in order to be born, you needed 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 second great-grandparents, 32 third great-grandparents. You can follow the line of reasoning down as it doubles every time. And you bring it down to 2,048 ninth great-grandparents. Just for every single one of us who is watching this right now, in order for you to be born today, those are just all the ancestors that are standing behind you right now. So for you to be born today from 12 previous generations, you needed a total of 4,094 ancestors over the last 400 years. I love it this as it's posed here. Think for a moment, how many struggles, how many battles, how many difficulties, how much sadness, how much happiness, how many love stories, how many expressions of hope for the future did your ancestors have to undergo for you to exist in this present moment? I've heard it said that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, and let us continue to build a better world for 7 generations to come. I love me some entertainment as well too. I believe education can be entertainment. Some shows I'd recommend: Reservation Dogs on FX and Hulu. Great way of showcasing Native humor, some different tribes as well too. Oftentimes irreverent, number of swear words, but always funny, always engaging. My grandmother, an elder approved of the Oneida Nation, she loves it. We watch the show together. We'll talk about it, one of our favorites. So I highly recommend checking it out. Just seeing the humor of Native peoples as well too. Not a monolith, but definitely a thing that you might see a cultural aspect for many Native peoples is humor, and having, for Oneida people, we have to have, it's ideally to be Oneida, having the good heart and that good mind is being a strong sense of peace and having that generous sense of humor. And Echo, also coming out on Disney Plus right here too, is in pre-production in 2022, so it should be coming out here in the near future. And if based on a graphic novel we're about to read here, a chapter, an excerpt from it, from a minute, from the Daredevil series, but a beautiful story. So let's get into it here. So this is taken from a chapter called Vision Quest, Echo. Highly recommend this graphic novel. It's called Moonshot. It has 3 different volumes to it. This is from volume 1. Volume 3 is Indigenous Futurism, of seeing Native peoples in the future, which is one of my favorites of all time. But this one as well too. Phenomenal story. So you're going to hear about Maya, and Maya happens to be deaf, and Maya is the narrator of this story as well too. So let's put our hearts and minds together as we listen to this story created by David Mack, a Cherokee artist who would listen to his elders and relatives in storytelling and put together this story for you all. So Maya here says, later on, when I realized there is this thing called sound, I will ask my father all kinds of questions like, what does laughter sound like? What sound does grass make? When I hear that rain makes a sound, I will ask, what sound do the clouds make? Does the sunshine make a noise? What does the rainbow sound like? And he says, when I ask him these questions, it makes him laugh and cry at the same time. And then I ask him what that sounds like. And Maya goes on to say here, but I say that I must learn my own language to tell my stories, more than signs, more than sounds, more than words. Pass on my stories through my own medium like the comic book artist, so that you can understand, even if you don't hear like me. Even if you don't know what sound clouds make, you could feel my stories. So it's with that, people, I say to you, Yawanko kunolúkhwa nakiwah. It means thank you, I love you, until next time. Take care of yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. If you want to bring peace to the world, first, bring peace to yourself. Invitation, not an obligation. Sit up nice and tall, like a string is pulling through your head. Taking the deepest breath of love you have had all day. Breathe in some love. Exhale some love. You are love. Go be the change you want to see in the world. I believe in you. You can do it. I love you.